Another episode of we've just done a rename. It's called Unfold. You have to let us know what you think of that. Um, yeah, so it's no longer making architecture. It's called Unfold, and it's because we're not just exploring architectural, but also so for example, today we're doing a bit of crits, a crit of an illustration done by a friend of ours, a friend of mine called Fuxia, Discord friend. And we're going to have a look at what she's done and what we can maybe do to review the narrative component of the image. This is a submission she did for the Bjornament competition. It's an annual competition run by Bjorn Hurry. And it's about creating an illustration basically just create illustration. And they're set on different themes. But excuse me if I'm talking a bit stiff today. My neck is in insane spasm, so I'm a bit uncomfortable while talking. We're going to be a short one today because it's only the one image that we're going to be criticizing, or critiquing rather. All right, let's begin. So the first image, this is the first submission she did. And then after this, she got a bunch of feedback from the judges, and then she went into this image. So we'll be critiquing the second image, I think, because well, she's already made the changes to the first one. Now, let me just first establish myself here that I am by no means an illustrator or a painter. My skill set is very much in the design area, and so we're going to be focusing purely on the design component of this image. And obviously with that, there is a narrative component attached to it. So I won't be focusing on composition or anything like that. It might be something that I mention, but it's definitely not the focus. All right, to start off with this image, you'll see there's a deer, a doe. I'm just going to fade out this image a little bit, just because it's again, it's not really about the image, it's more about the story the image is telling. Get this all sorted. All right, so to start, I've first got to say that the framing of the image is very successful. I find I'm able to read what's going on very easily. The background lighting is a bit bad, I can't see the image. So the actual composition of the image is done really well. And the main focus of this image is actually what's happening between these two characters. And that's essentially where our narrative is focused. There's some form of meeting that's happening between these two entities, and without a lot of information and without actually understanding what she's trying to achieve with this image, we're going to try and see if we can maybe point her in a direction or unlock some value for her, for Fuxia. All right, the first thing to look at is essentially this character, the fairy. All right. And the thing with fairies is that, well, we know they're creatures of the forest. And again, this is just an explored experiment. Obviously, it's not based on reality. Creatures of the forest. And you could almost argue that they're one with nature. You could maybe ask yourself, what kind of food do they eat? Now, these kinds of questions and statements aren't really so much about the image per se, but they could lead to a richness that we create. So, for example, let's say fairies, we can assume they're vegetarian. And maybe this discussion between these two is that this is actually her pet or companion. And maybe if that's the case, maybe Well, we'll get back to that. I got to think about this a bit more. This is not as simple as one imagines, especially when the image is quite vanilla in its narrative already. Because okay, well, let's just look at what she's wearing. I think that's a good point. So she starts with, she's got this kind of flower leaf kind of corset and these flower elements around her ankles and her hair. Why would she wear something like that? And how do they kind of stay together? So this flower, this leaf corset, how does that get made? What kind of components do you get stitched together on a base? Or and yes, we can absolutely say that magic plays a big part in this kind of narrative that's been created. Ooh, how's it, Rollomancer? Good morning. Thanks, man. Yeah, so the idea is essentially we take kind of, you send us image and I kind of analyze it and see what can come out of it. Kind of like the snow elf study. I found that my strength lied more in thinking about the problem than actually executing an image. So feel free to always post onto that group and maybe we can build something out of it. I'm starting off on a very tricky image, I think, to kind of create this narrative. So also, I can't remember what the theme was for this image. I don't know if you can remember, Roland, Rollomancer. Okay, so now let's actually look at this. I mean, I've looked a bit at what she's wearing, and those are the kind of questions we can ask. But I think the more important thing is, why are these two in this kind of embrace? Is it maybe that they survived an ordeal? Oh yeah, it came from nature, thanks. Thanks, Roland. Rodomancer. It came from nature. Then I've got to say, well, I think I would start with and so ask what came from nature. Is it the fairies? But we know these elements kind of come from nature. So what kind of new thing are you adding to this idea of what came from nature? I think this embrace, this connection here is actually what we need to discuss. And I think the background needs to almost give a clue as to why this is important. Why do we care about the fact that this doe and this fairy are having a moment together? What kind of experience have they gone through? And maybe that's what you can hint at in this image. You know, maybe, now I don't want to make everything always dark and negative and things, but it would certainly add some kind of narrative story if there was maybe an element back here that spoke of the doe having survived it, or there's some kind of component that explains why we should care about the fact that these two are actually together. And also, I mean, if I look at the image, I find it a bit strange. Why would she be sitting on a little bench made of stone, and this doe is coming from behind to hold her? Why is that kind of a framing happening? Why, for example, is the doe not? And from an image point of view, it's working. I'm not talking about the image. I'm just talking about the narrative. Why, you know, was she sitting down and this doe came and snuck up on her? And maybe the doe is what came from nature, or was the doe walking past and this fairy appeared? And if fairies are quite a common thing, I imagine this world that you've built, why is this special that this interaction is happening? And yeah, I mean, yeah, those are the kind of questions that I'm finding myself answering. Rollomancer, maybe you've got something else that you want to add and kind of think about. But okay, we'll call the dough Chris. And Judas. I mean, if I look at this, it gives the image supplies these kinds of emotions. It's serene. It feels like I'm being held, safe, feel comfortable. You know, very funny, Rotomancer. Super funny. Oh man, I completely lost a train of thought. Christo. All right. I swear those eyes look slightly Asian, man. Yeah, I did, eh? I totally did. Okay, just going back to this. What this image is kind of evoking. Comfortable, safe, serene. And if I look at that, it came from nature, right? So it came from nature, it already has a narrative component attached to it. Yeah, I did, Rotomancer. I hope you are actually lolling and not just using an emoji. It came from nature, right? So that's already got a narrative spin to it, right? There's action, there's movement, there's a state where it didn't come from nature, and now it did come from nature. And when I look at that, there's power in that kind of statement, right? There's an element of change that's occurring that the image needs to convey, right? That's actually the fundamental thing here, is that there's. Can you see any of that writing, Rotomancer? Is it clear? It's a bit dark. Maybe that's better. Not so much. Maybe it should be white. Oh, that's much better. Cool. Thanks, Rotomancer. So this idea of it came from nature, like I just mentioned, there's a change that's occurring, right? There's a state where it didn't come from nature, and there's a state where it came from nature. And I think that's maybe what's falling apart a bit for me with this image, is that there's I'm not aware of a state before or after. I just see a union, and sure, a union could mean that they were apart, but if they both come from nature, fairies and does, Christos, bright magenta, okay. No, that doesn't work, Rolls. Rotomancer. Oh, there we go. Very nice. You just use your color wheel knowledge. Cool, amazing. All right, so just going back to this idea. So you've got these two entities, and they're now coming together, and they're creating. There's a change that's happened because they've come together. And what is that change? And that change is what I'm interested in most as an observer. You know, and I mean, I could go into this idea of the fairy and the doe, but maybe, for instance, maybe there was a hunter, you know, that was back here. I'm just, again, just don't mind the drawings or anything, and maybe there was a spear that was thrown, and maybe, you know, the framing, your image composition will have to change, but that was able to, and the fairy came to kind of save the spear, to save the doe by blocking the spear. Then there's some kind of narrative that's happening there, and then it talks about it came from nature, or maybe it's the reverse. Maybe the fairy has been caught in a trap, and the doe somehow is able to kind of save the fairy. I think the only problem I have with this narrative structure, though, is that both of these elements are coming from nature. So it's not clear which ones you're referring to, and what kind of story you're creating because of it. I think, Rolemancer, just tell me if you think you agree with what I'm saying, if that makes sense. And maybe it's something to do with the foreground. So at the moment, all your focus is on the medium ground, and maybe there's an opportunity to have something, because at the moment your story, everything happens on one plane. It's all happening on your medium ground, and maybe if I look at a kind of a strong image, it's if the narrative entities kind of are breaking through those different foreground, background, medium ground, midground. You know, as soon as the narrative is breaking through the image on all three levels, it becomes a much richer image. And so maybe that's why I feel that although the framing is good, it's almost like some element here needs to be impacting this story here, and element in the background needs to be doing the same. Or maybe this foreground image, the midground image, is affecting the background image, so that you get a layering of the actual, narrative. Of course, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, images, are not really my strong point. It's just more about the design that I'm actually more interested in. Let's go into the actual characters. We'll leave that one for now. We want to purple. Okay, so yeah, exactly. Okay, perfect. Let's start looking at these kind of characters we've got. We've got the Christo, and we've got the fairy. All right, and at the moment, it's just a doe and a fairy. You've seen a doe and a fairy many a time. When I saw this image, it immediately kind of reminded me of Bambi meets what's that movie? I think it's called Children of the Forest or something, or Fairies of the Forest. And so we've seen this kind of fairy a million times. And I don't mean to be overcritical here, Fuxia, you just have to just bear with me here. And so I think a way to add more layering in the richness of is to also expand what these characters are, is to understand their backstory. So for instance, as I mentioned earlier, fairies. Okay, so we've got a typical fairy here. They like playing in the forests, so they're very kind of playful characters. They're fun-loving, or they're not very serious, obviously. And how does that kind of a character, how would that kind of character dress? And I'm not saying that what you've done is wrong. I'm just pointing in like maybe things that could be expanded upon. Maybe. And what about being cold? It's a forest. Forests don't have a lot of light. Typically, they are quite chilly. If you've ever gone hiking, you would kind of feel that. And sure, they're a magical creature, so they're one with nature. But maybe, why would she have this then as an item, and not maybe leggings or pants or something? And maybe she has like a bag or something that she has items that she would need, and maybe those items would be like food portions, maybe, or like what do fairies eat? Berries and but berries aren't all year round, so maybe there's some nuts as well. And if you think that you're one with nature, you live a harmonious existence with nature, you'd have to ask yourself, well, what kind of harmony do fairies kind of live in and exist in, and what kind of food would they eat then? So maybe they do eat meat. But then what kind of meat? Maybe it's insects. And what about water? They would have to drink some kind of water. Maybe it's warm because they're in the sunlight and they're in this clearing. So maybe, but she'll have like a cloak maybe, or a jacket of some sorts. And maybe it's not something that's all just in this bag. Maybe it's kind of draped over um, this bench that she's sitting on. Or maybe she was having lunch, you know, maybe she was actually sitting here and she was actually having a picnic. And there are things out here she's busy eating, and then this doe came and kind of surprised her. You know, maybe it can be a much more gentle and soft kind of conversation that's happening. Or maybe she's a like an animal whisperer. Maybe these fairies are animal whisperers. And maybe she's able to kind of marshal. She's like sharing her lunch and something with friends, or you know, maybe there's like birds and you know floating about. And maybe they're like kingfishers or something, and maybe you know you've got maybe beetles that are coming out to join them. I don't want to steal the Pied Piper kind of concept, but maybe that's something that's happening. And would she have some kind of a weapon to defend herself? And what would that weapon be? Maybe if I think of being in the wild forest and you're hiking or you're walking through or you're flying in her instance, maybe she would have something because she flies around. She's got these big, beautiful wings. Maybe there's different types of fairies. And then you ask yourself, well, what kind of a fairy is she? She looks at the moment kind of like she's got these, it's a bit of a confusing because at the moment she's got dead leaves and flowers. So she's got autumn elements and she's got spring elements combined. So maybe that's something that doesn't really make so much sense to me. If anything, this should be made out of flowers or super green, lush, verdant elements. There we go. So you have to look at like, yeah, I'm sure you do have a lot of different ones in Magic the Gathering. Rollomancer, you're definitely more of the fairy expert than I am. And if she's flying, does she always have her wings out? Or does she fold her wings away? You know, for example, why do fairies have these kinds of ears? You know, and why are the wings attached? Maybe they're removable wings. Maybe her cloak becomes her wings. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be that the one is equal to the other. And also, like, why paint a, you know, why is she white, for argument's sake? You know, if you think about a fairy, they're in the forest. Would she even have skin? Does skin make sense in this kind of a setting? I would probably argue against it because maybe she doesn't even have like clothing and things. You know, maybe it's that she's because if you think about it, she'll have to defend herself, so she will need some form of camouflage. Either she has a camouflage or she's got a weapon. So you kind of have to ask yourself: either she can defend herself, or she needs to hide. Maybe she's, you know, this like ultra bright danger sign symbol. Maybe she's just all red. You know, like those frogs. And she's super colorful. I think the question is to like kind of look at the image and go, okay, well, what kind of tropes am I aligning myself with, and why am I picking them, and to be aware of the choices that you're making. You know, you're not just have a look at those images Rollomancer posted. Oh, you see, that's much more interesting. Is this from Magic, Rollomancer? Yeah, the second one is a much more traditional type of look. But again, it seems to the image, the creature blends much more into its background. Whereas I find this one is, you know, it's like some poor kid got lost in a forest and this doe came and saved her. Oh, but wait, the kid is actually a fairy. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And I think, you know, maybe for instance, let's just have a quick run through. Like what would that look like? Let's look at this fairy and say, well, what could she be? Maybe she's got bark skin. Maybe she's a, what kind of, like, she's got flower skin. Or maybe she doesn't even have skin. Maybe it's fur. What about an insect fairy? You know, why does she have to be mammalian? Why can't, you know, what kind of other fair animals can you get? I mean, you get insects, you get mammals. Maybe she's a amphibian or a lizard. What's that? Yeah, a lizard type of fairy. I mean, is she mammalian? Does she nurse her children, or how does that work? You know, you've shown her with hair. Okay, fine, but maybe she doesn't have hair. I think of insect fairy could be very interesting, or maybe what happens is that there's a mix between the two. And maybe the form isn't human, not humanoid. You know, maybe the proportions are completely different. That's a good point, Brilliant. So the wings are too small. But again, I don't really want to go into the kind of... Yeah, actually, no, that's fine. I agree, Roman. So the wings are too small for this image. They do disappear, and that's the problem. I think that kind of breaks this image is that the fairiness is almost is very subtle, and it's not catching your attention. And I think if you were to be able to kind of focus and really nail down on what it is that a fairy is, and the kind of structures that a fairy would have, and maybe decide that you want to go, you know, use the tropes. Or, you know, what's it called when you counter them, essentially, or ignore them. Like, why do these animals have these kinds of, these fairies have these kinds of ears? Why? I mean, it's not a evolutionary thing, right? Long pointed ears. I would imagine that fairies probably have just really big ears. Because if you think of the form that our ears take, you know, maybe their head is like that big and their ears are these massive ears because they need to hear what's going on around them. Yeah. Okay. So as you can see, we're just running through this kind of thinking that goes behind the actual image. So instead of just criticizing the image or critiquing the image, try to start to understand, well, what kind of decisions are you making that you're not even aware of? I'm just going to relay this back to a building. You know, for instance, if you look at a building, we all imagine a building needs to be a square. That's what we've been taught. But a square building is actually not an ideal form. It's not efficient in terms of the amount of volume it contains. There's a lot of surface area. The most efficient form is a circle, is a sphere. So we'll say a half sphere, dome is the most efficient thing. And so if you don't question this, you'll always design these rectilinear structures. As soon as you start questioning the things around you, will you start understanding that the thing that you thought is for granted and should always be that way doesn't have to be that way at all. And that's how this relates to images, to world building. is that we assume things and we don't take that kind of logic through. If you take that logic through an image and you understand fully what it is that this world is creating, then your designs will become much stronger. Your images will become much stronger. So yes, we look forward to being able to look at more images in the future. Thanks very much for joining in, Rollermancer. It's been a joy having you on the chat. And thanks for your fantastic comments and jokes. Otherwise, have a good day, and we'll see you on the Bjornament on the Bjorn channel. Right, take it easy, and goodbye.